You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining The American Revolution. This week, episode 379, The Election of 1792. 1792 was an election year. This would be the third election for the new federal government under the Constitution, and only the second time that they would select a president. The first question for everyone was whether George Washington would run for re-election. Washington's reluctance to serve at all was genuine. Before the Constitutional Convention, Washington considered himself retired. The only reason he ran for president at all was because so many leaders begged him to serve, believing the Union would fall apart without him as a uniting figure. By spring of 1792, Washington figured he had gotten the new government off to a good start and could finally return to retirement. He asked James Madison to draft his farewell address. Even a few months earlier, Washington had confided in Thomas Jefferson that he planned to retire. At that point, Jefferson didn't discourage the idea, but told the president that he also planned to retire. A few months later, though, concerns over secession and other conflicts changed Jefferson's view. He began to argue that Washington needed to remain or the Union would collapse. He told Washington, quote, "North and South will hang together if they have you to hang on." By this time, Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton agreed on almost nothing, but on the issue of Washington remaining as president, they were on the same page. Hamilton said that the greatest evil that could befall the country would be if Washington left the presidency. The rest of the cabinet, which was just Henry Knox and Edmund Randolph, also felt the same way. Washington stepping down would likely mean the collapse of the Union and the end of the new federal government. Now, even beyond the cabinet, just about everyone felt the same way, even opposition members in Congress. James Madison strongly urged the president to remain in office. Perhaps the only person who did want him to retire was his wife, Martha. She was less concerned about the nation and more concerned about the fact that the president was getting on in years and that the job was too stressful for him. Washington had turned 60 in 1792. He was having health problems. He suffered from rheumatism, and he grew tired much more quickly than he used to. He also expressed concerns that his memory was beginning to fail and that his hearing problems were getting worse. Washington had suffered 2 near-fatal illnesses during his first term. He also had concerns about dying in office. It wasn't just that he wouldn't get to enjoy Mount Vernon in his final years. He felt that it would harm his reputation of walking away from power after the Revolutionary War. He also didn't want to set any sort of precedent that a president should remain in office for life. Washington also saw the same divisions in the country that other people did. Unlike others, Washington did not think he was the linchpin to hold the country together. Rather, he actually thought someone with better legal qualifications could handle the tough constitutional questions that were welling up. Growing divisions would inevitably harm his reputation. As president, Washington was going to have to pick a side on some of these contentious issues, inevitably alienating him from those who disagreed with his decision. He felt the sting of growing newspaper attacks and simply thought that he wasn't suited for the rough and tumble of national politics. He pushed back on those who told him that he was the only person who could hold the Union together. If that was the case, he would really be more like a king, something that he and the others had always fought against. By September of 1792, Washington had at least shown some willingness to consider the idea of remaining for a second term, based on the unanimous pleas of just about everyone who discussed the issue with him. But even by November, only a few weeks before elections, Washington had not committed either way. He still had a draft farewell address that he considered giving. No one was really sure if Washington would serve a second term, even if they elected him. Some historians believe that the tipping point was a letter that Washington received in early November from Elizabeth Powell. The Powells were a prominent Philadelphia family who had become socially close to the Washingtons during the war and remained close afterwards. Elizabeth and her husband Samuel had stayed at Mount Vernon during a southern trip after the war, and George and Martha frequented regular parties at the Powell's home in Philadelphia. Elizabeth wrote a lengthy letter to Washington in the weeks before the election, urging him to remain for a second term. The crux of her argument was that she knew Washington wanted to go home and enjoy life on Mount Vernon, but that leaving office would be shirking his duty to the country. His legacy would be destroyed if the Union collapsed because he simply wanted to walk away from it. He needed to remain in office for the good of the country. The general argument that the Union depended on Washington remaining was similar to what everyone else was telling him, but the notion that he was being selfish by leaving and going back to retirement seemed to strike a chord with the president. After that, there was no further discussion about leaving office that year. Once Washington determined that he would not announce his retirement, his re-election was considered a given by all Americans. No one seriously posed a challenge to him. The vice presidency was another matter. The Democratic Republicans were especially not fans of John Adams, who seemed to be growing more monarchical than they liked and tended to support the Federalist policies that they disliked. In fact, the Federalist Party supported Adams despite the fact that Adams refused to call himself a Federalist or associate himself with this nascent group that was largely headed by Alexander Hamilton. Adams and Hamilton did not get along much either. While the Federalist and Democratic Republican factions were beginning to organize politically, there still were no organized political parties as we know them today. There were Democratic Republican clubs that met in various states to coordinate efforts related to policies and candidates. They wanted to put up someone to run against Adams. Because the Constitution still had no election for vice president, any candidate would technically be running for president, but they all knew that they would be finishing second to Washington and that would secure them the vice presidency. The leading contender among Democratic Republicans should have been Thomas Jefferson, and he would probably be followed by James Madison. The problem with both men was that they were Virginians. The Constitution prohibited electors from casting both of their ballots for candidates that came from their home state. That meant that Virginia electors could not vote for both Washington and Jefferson. Since Virginia was the largest state with 16% of all electors, that would have put a vice presidential run for anyone from Virginia at a huge disadvantage. Instead, they largely settled on George Clinton, the governor of New York. Clinton had been governor of New York ever since the office was created in 1777. Before that, he had served in the Continental Congress and as a general in the Continental Army. During the war, Governor Clinton had been particularly aggressive in confronting New York Tories and seizing their property. He also had a good working relationship with George Washington, both during and after the war, despite some of their diverging political views. Clinton was also a staunch political opponent of Alexander Hamilton and many of Hamilton's initiatives as Secretary of Treasury. Clinton had also been an opponent of ratification of the Constitution. Because of his skepticism of a powerful federal government and his many years as governor of a large state like New York, he received wide support from Democratic Republicans across the country. He even received 3 electoral votes in the first presidential election, even though New York did not cast any votes in that election. You might think that Hamilton would become a high-profile political attack dog against Clinton's campaign, but Hamilton had a bigger fight at the time. Another New Yorker also threw his hat into the ring, Senator Aaron Burr. Now, Hamilton and Burr really hated each other, so Hamilton spent most of his time directing his wrath against keeping Burr's campaign from gaining any traction. The campaign was pretty short. Clinton did not get the Democratic-Republican endorsement until October, just weeks before the election. It really didn't matter since candidates considered it unseemly to campaign. As had been the case in 1789, the 1792 election was also not an election as we know it today. 12 of the 15 states did not hold popular votes for president. Some of the states that did hold votes in 1789 had taken that away. Instead, state legislatures chose the electors. Even in states that held elections, only a few hundred eligible voters actually went to the poll and voted for electors because of strict property requirements and other limitations. The result of the elections were that Washington was reelected unanimously. This was not a surprise to anyone. He had also been elected unanimously in 1789, but in that election only 10 states participated, giving him a total of 69 electoral votes. In 1792, 15 states participated, and Congress had been significantly enlarged, meaning we had a larger electoral college, so Washington received a total of 132 votes. John Adams came in second with 77 votes, returning him as vice president. He did receive an absolute majority, even though there were multiple candidates running. Adams won all of New England, as well as the mid-Atlantic states, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland. Clinton, of course, won New York, but the rest of his support, which totaled 40 votes, came from the South. He won Virginia, North Carolina, and Georgia. South Carolina was the only outlier, going for Adams. Kentucky cast 3 votes for Thomas Jefferson, while Aaron Burr managed to win a single electoral vote in South Carolina. Despite the strong vote of confidence for both the president and vice president, the elections showed a growing concern over many of the administration's policies. The federal assumption of debt and the creation of the Bank of the United States remained highly controversial, as were the high tariffs that were recently passed. They saw all of this as protecting the interests of the wealthy investor class at the expense of farmers and tradesmen. Many feared that the wealthy were becoming a new aristocracy. As a result, there was a major shift in Congress. The first and second Congresses had been overwhelmingly Federalist. The Democratic Republicans won a majority in the House and made gains in the Senate for the third Congress. The new senator from New York, Aaron Burr, quickly became a leading opponent of Hamilton's policies in the Senate. One of the bitterest and most controversial elections did not take place at the federal level that year. The fight was over the re-election of George Clinton in New York. Clinton's race for re-election as governor actually took place a few months before the federal elections, taking place in the spring, while the federal elections took place in the fall of 1792. Clinton had been in office for 15 years. His opponents called out his efforts to remain in office for life. They criticized his opposition during the fight over ratification of the Constitution. Beyond that, there was a state scandal over land sales. Clinton had allowed his cronies to buy up huge amounts of state land at pretty good prices. One of the sales was for a plot of land that was larger than the state of Connecticut. The opposition argued that land should have been sold in smaller lots so that regular people could become landowners. Politics in New York were always heated, but the Federalists saw an opportunity to unseat Clinton. One of the earliest opportunists to run against Clinton was Aaron Burr. Hamilton, however, quashed that and prevented Burr from making any headway. So before the election even got going, Burr gave up on the idea and backed Clinton. The Hamiltonians tried to recruit Robert Yates, who was actually more of an anti-Federalist than Clinton was. Yates had also opposed ratification of the Constitution, but the Federalists saw taking out Clinton as the primary goal, and many of them were willing to back any popular candidate who would go against Clinton. Yates wisely declined and continued to serve on the state Supreme Court. Another potential competitor was Stephen Van Rensselaer. He was only a state senator and still in his late 20s, but he came from one of the wealthiest families in New York and had become Hamilton's brother-in-law when he married Peggy Schuyler. However, he really didn't have enough background to justify running for governor. Hamilton added him to the ticket for lieutenant governor. After that, John Jay became a leading contender among the anti-Clintonites. And Jay was well known for his work in the Continental Congress, for helping negotiate the peace treaty that ended the Revolutionary War, and for his advocacy in adopting the Constitution. He had been one of the writers of the Federalist Papers. The problem was that Jay was also serving as Chief Justice in the United States Supreme Court. Would he choose to step away from court and run for governor? As it turned out, Jay was not happy serving on the court. Justices were required to be on the road most of the year riding circuit. Jay was having a new baby at home and wanted to get back to a job that did not require riding around the country all year. While Jay would not campaign for governor, he did allow his name to be put forward. And while Jay was well respected in New York and around the country, that didn't mean his opponents couldn't find dirt to throw at him. One of the attacks was over slavery. Jay was a slave owner. Slavery was still legal in New York, although it was not nearly as common as it was in the South. Jay, however, was not criticized for owning slaves. Rather, his opponents attacked him as a closet abolitionist. Jay had become head of the New York Manumission Society and had clearly begun to oppose slavery as an institution. Jay's opponents claimed that if he was elected governor, he would end slavery and take this valuable property away from slave owners in the state. And Jay responded to this that he thought all men of color had a right to freedom, but that he argued for a gradual abolition over time and a solution that would protect the rights of slave owners. Given this moderate position, the issue did not seem to catch on with the voters. One of the most effective issues that did prove to stick was his close relationship with William Duer. I've mentioned Duer in past episodes. He was working as a Treasury official under the Articles of Confederation, and at the same time trying to organize land deals in the Northwest Territory that would make him rich. Duer left the Board of Treasury in 1789 when it shut down with the rest of the Continental Congress. When he left, there was an unaccounted-for shortage of about $240,000, for which Duer had been responsible. Despite this hanging over his head, Duer went to work with the new U.S. Treasury Department as Assistant Secretary, helping to oversee the trade of government securities during Hamilton's Assumption Plan. Duer also personally invested heavily in securities and passed along insider information to his friends, helping them all to get rich in speculation. Duer was particularly heavily invested in the Bank of the United States stock. To get money from his scheme, he borrowed from just about anyone. This included deals with shopkeepers and other relatively poor working-class people who all hoped to get rich with this insider speculation. Duer turned out to be quite the slimeball. He engaged in all sorts of underhanded dealing, cheating his business partners and just about everyone else. Still, his scheme worked for a time. Seeing this paper bubble form, another group of investors, led by the Livingston family, withdrew large sums of gold and silver from all the banks. This triggered a credit freeze that made it impossible for Duer to continue paying his debts with more loans. As a result, Duer could not make his promised repayments on his debt and ended up going to debtor's prison, owing money to just about everyone in the state. This made him probably the most unpopular man in New York, if not the country. An angry mob surrounded the jail where he was being held, trying to pull him out so that they could lynch him. One wealthy investor showed up with a pair of pistols, demanding a duel if Duer could not pay him what he owed. Duer's collapse led to a massive financial panic and the first major stock market crash in U.S. history. Hamilton was eventually able to restore the markets by having the government make massive purchases of government securities in order to restore liquidity and confidence in the markets. But it came at the cost of many fortunes being lost to this speculation. Dozens of wealthy investors also went bankrupt, and all of this was fresh in the minds of New Yorkers who were ready to take their revenge on anyone who could be associated with Duer in any way. Jay was a friend and business associate of Duer. While Jay was not implicated directly in this securities scandal, his association with Duer was enough for many people to not want anything to do with him. Robert Livingston, who had been Jay's former friend and law partner, and who played a major role in crashing Duer's scheme, wrote considerably about Jay's relationship with Duer. Jay was away in New England during the final weeks of the campaign, riding circuit with the Supreme Court, so he was unable to respond to any of the allegations that were made against him. Despite all this, when the election finished in late April of 1792, it appeared that Jay had won. Clinton's supporters, however, were not ready to give up. When it was time for the votes to be counted, they disputed the ballots in 3 of the counties upstate, Otsego, Tioga, and Clinton counties. These had all voted heavily for Jay. State law required that the ballots be delivered to the Secretary of the State by the county sheriff. Each of these 3 counties had failed to follow the law to the letter. In Tioga County, the sheriff had given the ballot box to a deputy, but the deputy got sick during his journey and had a clerk carry the box the rest of the way. In Clinton County, the sheriff forgot to deputize the person who he had deliver it. In Otsego County, the newly appointed sheriff received the ballot box several days before he received his formal commission of appointment as sheriff. The Clinton faction challenged these 3 counties and argued that the ballots should not be counted. The Board of Canvassers voted along party lines to reject the ballots from these 3 counties, so they were not counted. The refusal to count the ballots led to waves of protests from Jay supporters. Even Thomas Jefferson wrote privately that Clinton should refuse to take office under these circumstances. When Jay returned to the state a few weeks later, his supporters urged him to contest the decision. Several mobs had formed, leading to a few bloody riots in various towns as competing groups challenged these results. Jay certainly didn't want to lead a mob to the Capitol. Instead, he called on the state legislature to form a convention to resolve the issue. A majority of the legislators, however, supported Clinton and voted down the idea of a convention. While Jay considered the result an injustice, he opted to accept the result. Continued fighting would only harm the state. Clinton would return to office for another 3 years. Now, next week, we're going to take a look at one of the more controversial acts of Washington's second term, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show on the Airwave Media Network. Thanks to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis, Michael Mulhern, Mitchell Anderson, and Gordon Kemp. Thanks also to Robert Morris Circle supporters Chasen Harrison, and welcome back Ron Thorson, who upgraded again to the Robert Morris Circle. I also want to welcome Dale Enders and Nolan Clark, who joined at the standard bearer level. Everyone who supports this podcast on Patreon at the $10 level or higher gets a new magnet from the American Revolution each month, or at least they should. I have some news on the magnet front. Last year, I promised special, limited edition magnets for each month in 2026. I ran into some supply problems, so you guys have been patiently waiting for me to make good on my promise. I finally got word from my supplier that the magnets should arrive at the end of next week. I'm getting all 12 magnets for 2026 delivered, so there shouldn't be any future delays this year. I will be sending out the January and the February magnets a few days after I receive them, so you'll be getting 2 magnets instead of 1. Then in April, I will be sending out both the March and April magnets, meaning another double delivery so that we get finally caught up. I really appreciate everyone's patience as I've dealt with these delays. Also remember that if you don't want to make an ongoing contribution, I gratefully accept one-time gifts via PayPal or Venmo to help support this podcast. This week we covered the 1792 elections, which were the third elections for Congress and the second elections for president. Through most of our history, we've taken for granted the peaceful transition of power in the United States. At this time, though, a large portion of the world did not believe that this could really work. That's why they had monarchs who ruled for life. Most Americans had come to oppose that idea, believing that this really was a government based on principles, not based on the personality of any single man, no matter how great that man was. That was one reason that Washington was reluctant even to serve a second term. He didn't want to be seen as grasping for office, and as I said, one of his greatest fears was that he would die in office during his second term, and that history would deride him for becoming a dictator for life. He very much wanted his legacy to be a man who stepped away from power to prove that America could be a nation based on ideas rather than ruled by a single man. Now, the biggest takeaway from the federal elections was that the Democratic Republicans were growing in power and stepping up their organization. The leaders were not just thinking about power in their own states, they were organizing so that they would have like-minded people in Congress from across the country. Now these, as I said, were not political parties as we know them today, but we do see organized factions that were coordinating national strategies. Now, this is not to say that politics was all about ideals. The association of power and money with politics has always been a reality, and this era is no exception. Students of New York history are probably familiar with Tammany Hall in New York. This was one of the first major political machines in America, running New York for the Democratic Party for decades. It became known for its corruption and its use of government jobs to hold political power. The Tammany Society began in 1789, and even at that time it was explicitly a political society from the start. Governor George Clinton was an early supporter, and relied on the society to get votes in New York City. Aaron Burr was also an early supporter, hoping to use Tammany as an organization that could counter the Society of Cincinnati, which Alexander Hamilton used to dominate New York politics through its organization. Now, we also got a taste of politicians messing with elections, as Governor Clinton was able to get the ballots of 3 counties voided in order to guarantee his reelection. As I mentioned in the main episode, Clinton had been governor for 15 years, and many people saw this as a bad thing. Clinton ended up not running for re-election at all in 1795, and he remained out of office until 1800, when he returned to the New York Assembly. The year after that, he would be drafted to run for governor again, but he left that office to become vice president during the 1804 elections. John Jay would remain on the U.S. Supreme Court, although while sitting as Chief Justice, he took time to go to Britain in 1794 and negotiate a treaty there. The so-called Jay Treaty of 1795 was highly controversial, and we'll probably get to that in a future episode, but the Jay Treaty did not stop Jay from winning election as governor of New York in 1795. When Jay left office in 1801, he was offered a chance to return as Chief Justice of the United States because that office had opened up again, but he turned it down and retired from public life. He did, however, remain active in the abolition movement. New York finally signed an abolition law in 1799 while Jay was governor, but as he had promised in 1792, it was a gradual abolition. It was being phased out, but slavery remained legal in New York until July 4th, 1827. I mentioned William Dewar's scandal, which resulted in the financial panic of 1792. Dewar would spend the rest of his life in debtor's prison. He died there in 1799. Other securities dealers wanted to make sure nothing like this would ever happen again. They agreed that there needed to be a more organized securities market to prevent wealthy or well-connected speculators from abusing the system. The security dealers met at 68 Wall Street on May 24, 1792, to sign the first agreement regarding the sale of securities. Over time, this group of brokers grew and established more rules for trading. In 1817, they formalized their organization into what became known as the New York Stock Exchange. My book recommendation this week is The Elections of 1789 and 1792 and the Administration of George Washington, edited by Arthur Schlesinger. I recommend this book advisedly. Despite its title, there's not a great deal of information on the elections themselves. Most of the book is devoted to the administration, and coverage is not as in-depth as other books are. This entire book is only about 100 pages, and much of it is reproductions of speeches. This was part of a book series, probably designed for high school students, that looked at key elections and administrations in U.S. history. If you want to take a closer look at it, there's a borrow-only copy on archive.org. Much of the other information for this episode came from biographies, covering people like Washington, Hamilton, and Jay, and many of those I've already recommended to you. You might want this book on elections as a reference, or for a younger person's introduction to the era. If you do, get The Elections of 1789 and 1792 and the Administration of George Washington, edited by Arthur Schlesinger. My online recommendation is an editorial note from the National Archives called The Disputed Election of 1792. This note originally came from a book that included the papers of John Jay. It's a great summary of the New York election in 1792. As always, I've included direct links to this article on my blog and in the show notes. My question this week asks, what do you think about the removal of information about Washington's slaves from the Independence Mall site in Philadelphia? Well, I really try to stay away from modern politics in this podcast. For those of you who haven't been following this, the Park Service recently removed a bunch of images that were posted on the site where Washington's presidential mansion used to be across the street from Independence Hall. The city of Philadelphia is suing over the incident because, according to an agreement with the federal government, they were supposed to be advised about any changes to the site. The way it was removed was kind of messy, and the fact that they removed it and didn't replace it with something else, I think, was a mistake. This does get to a larger question, though, about how much slavery should be emphasized, sometimes to the neglect of other important issues. The discussions over slavery at the site were relevant, but I've been there before they were removed, and I always kind of thought that it was overemphasized. I would have liked to have seen more there about Washington's presidency, since the site was where Washington lived while he was serving as president. I've tried to cover slavery in context within this podcast. While slavery did become an all-consuming issue by the 1850s, it really was a side issue in the 1790s. Because that is the way that contemporaries treated it, so have I. Next week, we are going to cover the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. This will give me more of a chance to discuss the status of slavery at that time, and I think we should discuss it, but we also have to keep in mind that it was probably not in the top 10 political issues of most people in the 1790s or earlier. The history of slavery is important. We should study it. There should be some mention of it at various historical sites, perhaps even at the Independence Mall, but I would like to see other important issues covered as well. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me either via email or on X, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.